Okay, good morning, everybody. I am, in my 15 minutes this morning, going to try to bring together a few threads of topics that we discussed here today in the context of that idea. And yes, so we're talking about aging and what is it. And there are several avenues for coming at the problem, and what I'm going to propose to you this morning is that you can consolidate them in the context of an extremely simple idea, namely that life is engineering, not miracles. Now, this is I like to start out my lectures on this subject with a fish, and I ask myself, if you're designing a fish, how many lengths do you need to make a fish? I think it's hard to tell, but certainly many thousands. So when you're building a fish, you need to have meter sticks, and you need to have instruments that tell how big that part of the fish is in order to decide whether to grow it more or not. What these meter sticks are is not known. Now, I have some ideas about what these meter sticks might be, but they're not particularly relevant today. They are a little too controversial also to talk about right now. So let's just say as a fiducial that when engineers want to achieve length measurement, they do it with waves. And the reason they do it with waves is because it's very, very plastic. When you have a fixed speed in the problem, which is a relationship between time and length, then you can measure length with clocks. And you can make standing wave measurements and count fringes. And it's very, very easy to change the sizes of things simply by changing the speeds of things. Now, let's put this aside now, because the particular way that the meter sticks are made, is not particularly germane to what we're talking about today. This is an example of the action of meter sticks in one of the more controlled ways you see it, which is early embryos. These are fruit fly embryos, and what you see is the famous pictures you see all the time of early embryo morphogens that have been fluorescently tagged. In this case, it's done with antibody staining. Now, and so what you see is that there are patterns in the proteins that develop even in early stages when the egg is still symmetric. This has the additional wrinkle, as you know, that these are fruit flies. They're syncytia, so that means there are hundreds of nuclei, maybe thousands of nuclei in there, but there are no cell walls, so no cell membranes. So the nuclei are talking to each other through cytoskeletal structure there, but the cell membranes don't exist, so that means the cells, as we normally think of them, don't exist. Now, this picture is particularly important for what we're going to talk about today, because these two flies are not the same size. So these are embryos of Drosophila. These are embryos of a related fly that's bigger. And the thing I want you to notice is that the morphogen gradients are scaling with the embryo size. There have been a lot of studies, particularly by this Princeton group, just hammering on this problem, showing that even small variations, one egg to another in Drosophila, will cause a scaling of the main master morphogen gradient in the problem, which is bicoid. They also cloned that bicoid gene and replaced its homologue in the other fly, and found that there was no change. It was still scaling with cell egg size. It's a nice experiment, so it shows that the chemistry of this particular protein is not what the meter stick is. Now, let's mention this too. So this is a big body of work showing that the system is sensing how big the egg is, and then adjusting how it grows the thing based on the measurements. There's the further wrinkle that, for reasons I think nobody understands, the mRNA expression is tracking the protein expression. So in the early days, people thought it was a protein gradient caused by generation of protein here and sinking through the organism. Well, no, that's incompatible with the mRNA tracking the protein. Okay, so there's sizing stuff going on even in an early embryo that you don't understand. Okay, the sort of broad brush picture you understand, but the details don't work. So you don't really know what the meter stick is. And then we go forward. How in God's name can you use fuzzy meter sticks to make something like that? Okay? Now, this is a complete triviality, but that exists. Okay? So the existence of that thing is a fact. It's an experimental fact that is no less important than biochemical experimental facts. So the thing has somehow figured out how to make the thousands and thousands and thousands of links that it requires to build its body and to shape itself using them in ways that are kind of escaping us at the moment. Now, in thinking through how this might have come about, the idea kept coming into my head that this is an engineering problem. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you've got links to adjust, okay, this involves measurements of distance that you have to relate to each other by mathematics. It's very, very hard to do that. It's very, very hard to write down equations that represent the relationships among these links unless you have some really simple rules. And though your need for those rules is so intense that there is reason to expect you might invent them. You might manufacture them even if there were no physics available for you. You might manufacture the rules you need. Once you have them, then your task is to build something. Building something, you're in an innovation race with all the other builders. So you're not working miracles. What you're doing is you're making tiny changes to your design, putting the thing in the field, and seeing if it beats the competition. And so there's a master, in this case it's natural selection, which is deciding whether your innovation is good or not. If you happen to tune onto one of these simplifying rules, suddenly many more of your innovations will pass the test because it's for exactly the same reason that it works in engineering. And so there's a natural tendency for the system to find them and to go that way, just the way engineers would. Now, so what I want to do now is think a minute about the larger implications of that simple idea, that biology is not a miracle of evolution, but rather it's evolution figuring out how to be an engineer, rather the way we do. If we can't figure out how it works, probably nature couldn't figure it out either. Now, this is a little gruesome, but I put it up here to make a point. This is, of course, a face transplant. And this is technology that is well deployed in the field right now thanks to immunosuppressive drugs. And you have a bad damage to part of your body, you have a transplant, and it fixes it. This grafting that one does is possible only because the face has a shape. What I mean by that is when the face on the original person formed, it was growing in various dimensions, and then it stopped. It made a decision to stop, and it remembered where it stopped. So there's memory in the face, in the structure of the face. We don't know where this memory is stored, but we do know that it exists, and the proof of it is that grafts will work. In other words, when you put the graft on the person, the face doesn't slowly morph into the old person's face, okay? It remembers the original milieu in which it grew and maintains it. And we don't know whether it's dynamic whether it's mechanical. We really don't know where the memory resides. But we do know that it decided to stop growing. And the decision to stop growing was communal. That is to say, it wasn't just one cell making the decision. The process of forming a body part means that you act together. You have a community of individuals that are talking to each other, they're making measurements, they're communicating with each other, and then they make a collective decision to stop. Now, so that's a fact also. When we're talking about aging, there's a constant discussion about cells making decisions that are permanent. Why? And here is an example of such a thing. This decision to become permanent is not because the cells were damaged, it's because their job was done. And if they grew more, it would distort the face and make it wrong. So in us, there are some decisions to stop growing that have nothing to do with damage. They have nothing to do with pathologies. They're actually switches that are in the system that are designed to make shape and form. Now, you might ask, well, do you need those? Are they irreversible? Well, in the case of grafting the human body, they're at least as irreversible as a human lifetime. I have no idea if you lived 1,000 years whether the parts would slowly morph into look more like you did originally, but in the human lifetime scale, the things that you graft in maintain their shape and form the way they had them for the lifetime of the body. Now, why would you do that? Because making machines is hard. Now we say, well, evolution can do anything, so it doesn't make any sense for making machines. Well, yes, it does. Yes, it does, because when you're a race to beat the other car company, you have to make the engine innovations faster. And so you have to have your technology under control. And you don't have time to put little fix-it mechanisms into your engine if you want to win the race. While you're fine-tuning the fix-it mechanisms, your competition is busy making design innovations, and then they crush you in the marketplace, which means they eat you. So one obvious reason in engineering that you make things that eventually fail is simply that it's hard to make things that don't fail. Now, this is a fact also. We have lots of machines in our lives that eventually fail. Now, we joke and we say, well, it's planned obsolescence, they have to fail. Well, but there aren't any counterexamples. Okay? All machines fail. Now, we could make theories of why that's so, but it's so much simpler just to look at the data. Okay? All machines fail, and they fail faster when they're more complicated. And that's just the principle of engineering. So it's very easy to understand why a living thing would make a switch decision to stop, a permanent, irreversible decision, because it makes the design work better, it makes the design fast, it makes the building cost much less, and you win the competition. But you don't win it forever because the machine eventually doesn't work anymore. This is true even for your brain. So computers, it turns out, last a long time. They're very robust. They're very robust things, but they don't last forever. So the electrons in them are actually mechanical. And as they move, there is design degradation that just happens naturally, and eventually the computer will fail. Thus, there is no reason that information technology would be any different. Obviously, in the case of your brain, there's another reason to stop changing, which is if you monkey with that circuitry, it won't remember properly. Okay? So in the case of your brain, you don't want any more building. You want the memories not to be erased. You want the memory to be as permanent as possible so that you can run away from the dinosaur the next time you see it. So there are actually practical reasons to make the growth stop that also have nothing to do with pathologies. Now, in engineering as we know it, there are some cases where the machine has to last a particularly long time. Jets are a beautiful example. They're very well-built machines, and I don't know of a single example of a jet falling out of the sky because its wings fatigued. They're just incredibly well-built, and the reason is obvious, that there would be a tremendous economic penalty if a jet failed as your company goes down. So immense amounts of resources are put into making jets last a long time, and they do. So it isn't true that you couldn't make a machine last a long time. It's just normally you're such a busy race to beat the competition that you don't have time to do it. But there's no reason in principle why you couldn't do it. So it's, by analogy then, in the body, there are shortcuts that one probably took to stop the troublesome growth process and not to put the repair mechanisms in because they're too expensive to design, and just move on. But you could have. Now, what the hell? All right, I've got a slide missing. I'd like you all now to imagine a slide, which is a salamander leg, right? I have a nice picture, but it's not here. So the salamander or a newt will regenerate a leg, and it's the adult that does it. You chop the leg, and a bud forms, and then the leg grows, and it makes an elbow in the right place, and then it stops. That's a vertebrate version of what happens all the time in metamorphosis in insects, where the body is disintegrated and rebuilt from scratch. Now in this case, it's particularly important because as the arm grows, this limb regrows, it's measuring its lengths and sizes. It's talking to different parts of it are talking to each other. They know there's a problem, they're trying to fix it. They don't ever get too wide, they're measuring the width constantly. And when it gets long enough and has generated the right number of digits, it stops. Okay? Now the fact that that happens proves that there is communication among body parts, invertebrates, on the scale of the animal itself when it's grown. That particular effect is not possibly encrypted in memory in the cells that are doing the growing. It has to be in the organizational rules that the parts have as they're growing. Regeneration of limbs is otherwise impossible. So those are two limits that we've talked about in the case of aging and death, which is things encrypted in the genes on the one hand and things that just are accidents on the other. Now, the idea that I'm throwing out to you folks this morning is that those two ideas are different sides of the same coin. There are very primitive repair mechanisms in the body, in all bodies, that work a lot. For example, when you do a transplant, it vascularizes. Okay, so the vascularization machinery is very inventive, and it sends blood vessels in and constructs them so there's a food supply for the new tissue. So the stop command has been given for the overall structure, but the stop command has not been given for the blood vessels. They are in a different circuit, and they are following a different set of rules. The blood vessels are also not targeted to particular places in the new tissue because it didn't even exist before. The blood vessels are strategizing, solving a problem on the fly in order to get the blood where it needs to go, and they're talking to each other as they do it because they don't want to crowd each other and they want to get the blood to where it has to go as quickly as possible. So the message here is that in the body there are some primitive repair mechanisms that are on all the time. They're highly conserved because you can't live without them. And there are others that got thrown away as, well, you could have built them, but it was just not cost effective. If you have to stop the growth in order to make something with shape, the only issue is whether that stopping is permanent or not. Okay? If you make it permanent, there's no more trouble. If you make it impermanent and have the requisite machinery, you can grow a new leg. But if you never have to grow a new leg, there's no reason at all just not to throw the permanent switch and then move on. There's your management doesn't care one way or the other, and you get less cancer. So we come now to the conclusion here, which is that would like everybody to just ponder the idea that in the life sciences, sometimes there's a disconnect with common sense that comes from a belief, actually, that evolution is so brilliant that it can do anything. And what I think is that as the evidence piles up, there's piles and piles of experiments, what it's telling me is that that's not right. What it's telling me is that the principles of engineering are actually something in nature. They're not a figment of the imagination of people at all. And what happened was that 2 billion years ago, the biota found them by trial and error, and they used them to construct their bodies because there is no other possibility. Nature simply won't allow any other possibilities. And then they turn out to be the same rules that we humans figured out 2 billion years later by reason. And the reason is because those rules are actually not figured out at all. They're there in nature to begin with, and we simply understood them. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much for that presentation. It was very well done. I'd like to suggest for your consideration the possibility that one rule that might work is the phenomenon of telomere attrition. In telomere attrition.
Yeah, he's bringing up telomeres.
I'm not suggesting that telomere attrition has anything to do with aging, incidentally. I'm only suggesting that it might work in situations that control the reproductive capacity of specific classes of cells. We don't know the telomere attrition capability of cells in which that attrition might occur in one chromosome or in more than one chromosome.
Yeah.
So it represents but we do know that it occurs, and it limits cell replication, normal human cell replication.
Yeah. Now,
so I'm just wondering whether you would consider that as a possibility.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because there's a big telomere subculture, and I've been at conferences, this one actually a year ago, where there was a lot of conversation about telomeres. One of the things that came up is that some mammals don't have any. They simply don't have them. Now, that tells you that telomeres are not, it proves that telomeres are not an essential component. It doesn't prove that they do nothing. It simply means that you can build an animal without them. Now, the real answer to this question is that solutions to engineering problems are often non-unique. One of the things you think about often in biochemistry as well, the darn thing is so hard that there has to be one particular pathway to achieve it. But when you step back from the problem a little bit, when you're making a body part, the thing you've got to do is stop. You have to stop. And that's fundamental. And there's more than one way you can stop. And you can have backup stops. You know, you can say stop, stop. And some of those things could easily have made the structure better and particularly more robust to cancer, which is the idea that always goes through your head. Right. So what I think is a rather more healthy way to think of the problem is that you have a design problem to solve namely to stop. And there's nothing pathological about it at all. It's fundamental to building a body. You just have to stop. And you can make a decision about whether to stop permanently or not, but you certainly have to stop. And then these various things we're talking about are technologies. They're technologies for achieving this thing that you have to build. So yes, it may very well be that telomeres are part of the control system in some cases and others. The aggregate outcome is the same, namely the body is formed and is protected against disease. But I think that particular one doesn't have to be universal because you could achieve it other ways, and therefore the absence of telomeres in some animals isn't really that worrisome.
I'm not suggesting that it's universal. I'm just suggesting that it's one of the only known ways that we're aware of today that makes a cell lineage stop replicating.
Okay. Now, we've talked a lot about methylation as an easily detectable epigenetic record, okay? Now, nobody knows where the memory is. The fact that you can graph body parts proves that there is one. There are many, in fact.
Well, I showed that cells have a memory.
Yes, you did.
In respect to the limitations of telomere attrition.
Yes, you did. And that's one of the many ways they can have it. So that's an actual genetic modification,
That is a memory.
right? And there is also epigenetic memory of various kinds. One that's easy to see as methylation, one that's less easy to see as a stable chemical state in the cytosol, right? So there are lots of possibilities for where this memory is located, and maybe it's more than one place. I personally think that the issue of regenerative medicine and aging and cancer, which are kind of related things, all revolve around that central problem, namely where does the memory reside? And a sub-question of that is there some way you can trick it so as to usurp or bring back from the dead one of these ancient regeneration methods that the newt and salamander have got, but we've lost? Maybe it's just there, hidden away, turned off, and you could bring it back. But you can't begin to know where to look until you understand how it controls itself. Anyway, is that a sensible answer to the question? Okay, thanks.
Did Darcy Thompson talk about stopping?
No, Darcy Thompson's book is about observations. Stuff like that is in Darcy Thompson, but those are diatoms, of course. Yeah, so he made huge numbers of observations about relationships, sizes of parts of things, and also drew analogies between stuff that you see in the physical world at small scales. But he didn't speculate about how it was happening very much because nobody had the tools. Okay? The genetic memory was not known where that was at the time. How basic mechanical parts worked and wasn't known. And I think also the biggie in my head was dynamic control. What I mean by that is in your eukaryotic organisms such as us, there's cytoskeleton stuff that's controlling shape. And there's some sort of internal control machinery that tells the microtubules what to do that we don't completely understand yet. With those things, those machines, you can begin to emulate stuff that you thought was fundamental physics, but actually isn't. It's emulated. It's pretend. Okay, with those machines, you can cook up fictitious mechanical rules that are proxies for similar ones in nature, but of course are vastly more powerful because you created them, you manufactured them. So my 2 cents worth is that idea is coming, and that's what's missing from Darcy Thompson. He kept trying to find how fundamental physics was controlling life, and he kept coming up empty because we kind of know now that doesn't happen. Okay, so what I think is implicit in that book is exactly the reverse. So that life figured out a way to create stuff that's like you see in small-scale chemistry as a means, as an engineering strategy for controlling his body.
The middle way.
Well, you know, it's funny, the middle way. I'm becoming very radical on this as I delve into the experiments more and more. I don't think there's any middle way. I think there's one way. I think there's one way, and I think that's the reason that you see so many similarities between biological engineering and human engineering. It's not because biology is doing our wishes. It's because there are just a very small number of ways you can get the job done, and you're kind of stuck with them. Yeah, so my guess, the way it's going to turn out is there's no middle way, there's one way.
I'd be interested in just hearing your response to an idea. So this problem of not only growing a limb, but actually matching that limb to the existing limb so that they don't have a long leg and a short leg,
Right.
Also means that there's a sensor of aging or size. There's a sensor of size that's around.
Yes, sir.
So there are two kinds of sensors which are known in development for the regeneration, first of all, of the limb at the beginning, not even the regeneration. So the body parts are built, and then the first problem is to get oxygen to them. And the bloodstream explores the area. It's like microtubules. They literally explore the area, with hypoxia being the drug that gets blood vessels to come into new areas. So when they no longer have hypoxic signals, they can stop. And that in fact, the blood vessel plan in a new limb versus an old limb doesn't have to be the same. And the same is true for the neurons. The neurons come in after the muscles, innovate them so that the muscles work, and they're in the same game. They're following a pattern, but it's not an absolute pattern. It's the blood vessel and the nerves actually will look different in both legs, yet they function the same. And nerves in particular can sense how long it takes for electrons to go from one distance to another. So it's like a clock in some sense, or it's like, well, it is a clock translating into a length, right?
Yes. Now, there's a lot of ideas that came up, and I wish we'd have time to talk about some of them more in detail. Immediately, there is an idea that pervades this whole discipline, broadly construed, that you're going to take elementary diffusive chemistry and make structures with it, because that's all you have. Okay? And the jury is still out on that. I have, in my own head, decided that there's something missing. Now, the way I came to that is a very physicist's way of doing it, and it's not make everybody comfortable, but I'll tell you what it is. If the thing it's doing is very sophisticated, and if you've understood it, you should be able to write an equation for it. You should be able to write equations that describe it very accurately, that you write better equations that describes it better. If you find you can't do that, it usually means you're off task, that there's something missing. Now, I am in a hot seat right now. I've got a paper out that's new. I have speculated that what the missing thing is reaction diffusion that's dynamic, waves. And that what's happened is we've gotten in a trap where the very powerful spectroscopies of biology are all slow. So they're missing them. And those things are they're what are doing it. So you're completely correct. When you grow a new limb, something has to be measuring the other one, okay, and comparing them, because there's no memory of it. So Yeah, so what I suspect is that the morphic fields that nobody could ever find and that are sort of highly discredited things are actually dynamic reaction diffusion waves. Now, nerve impulses are a particular example of that, where the gain is turned way up, so they're nonlinear. And also, they go super fast because the fundamental diffusive process is electrical. So what electrical give you is lightning speed. But the principle of making the disturbance propagate in a linear way, actually, is much more general than that. So the nerve impulses actually are reaction diffusion waves. They're not really electrical at all. And so the generalization of that idea is very simple, and it applies kind of to anything. Now, since we're in speculation mode and we're on TV now, well, heading my list of suspects for what the thing is potassium. The reason is that it has to be built on something that diffuses fast and is conserved, and that you regulate. And the electrolyte ions, the charged one electrolyte ions, are the things in your body that have the highest diffusion constants except for protons. And protons won't work because they're not conserved. So yeah, I'm suspicious that the armies of potassium regulators that are in everything, including plants, are part of the sizing machinery. And that's what they're actually doing there. They're not actually osmotic regulators at all. Now, that's way out in left field. I think for me as a theorist, what I'm trying to do here is to get the question on the table. So the question is, there's an engineering thing going on that hasn't been located yet, okay? Now, to drive the nail home, you've got to find it, okay? You have to figure out what the correct speed scale is, what the timings are, lock into it, and find it. So it's ultimately this experimental problem. You know, biology and physics are both experimental sciences. You have to find it. I'm basically throwing hand grenade into the discussion by saying, look, people, I understand how your experiments work really well, and the fact of the matter is the really powerful things you got in your lab are all slow. So it's very possible that an entire chapter of the Book of Life is invisible to you because you don't have timing. Now, that's not having to do with aging, okay? It is peripherally related in that when you build a body, you have to have signals, decisions that the cell make that have nothing to do with pathologies, that have to do with starting and stopping of growing. And so those things not working quite right can easily account for aging and also for the scaling of the time scale on which you go through your aging cycle from one animal to the next. Okay, there's it's built in. The screw ups of the system that get set in when you make the command to stop are locked in, and once they're locked in, there isn't any way to undo them except to chop off the limb and regenerate it. And we can't do that. I'm sorry, I'm maundering. So that's yes, you're completely, absolutely correct. This regeneration is screaming out at you that there's a measurement process that's more global than just the regenerating arm. Yeah.
I think we have to move on. I think you're just going to have to ask him over lunch. 40 minutes or 15 minutes.
It's sort of complicated systems like Darcy-Thompson.
Okay, almost. There's an intermediate step. So biochemistry is complicated. I mean, it's complicated to me, okay, how these engines work. So the idea that I'm throwing out is in order to actually build the bodies, the thing had to invent simplicity, okay? It had to invent some simple global rules that it constructed, it manufactured with this machinery. Once it achieved that, then it had this incredibly powerful tool for making plastic forms. So no, it's actually manufactured simplicity is the idea.